So when I'm asked to review an article, the first thing I do is I read the abstract, and I ask myself, is this something that I can help with? Because sometimes you will be assigned an article that's a bit out of your area of expertise, and if I don't feel like I have something that I can bring to the task, then I may say, no, thank you, I shouldn't review this article. Um, Once I've accepted the review, I actually try not to let it sit around. I recognize there's a several week goal of getting reviews back, but I try to do it almost as soon as I can. I began almost immediately by skimming the article. I do a light read. I try to get a sense of what the article's about, what the argument is, what the methods were, what the findings are, what the conclusions and implications are. And then I go back and I do a much slower read where I actually comment. And as I'm reading, I usually work in a PDF format. I'm using PDF tools to mark it up, to highlight things that I want to think about more, to have my own running conversation with the article as I'm reading it. And then I may go and do a little side research. So once I've commented, things that I'm not sure about or things I want to look into more, I may do a little searching on my own through my own databases of articles that I've used over the years, or just as you would normally do literature kind of review work. I'm usually trying to answer questions like, is this work unique in a certain way, or have they neglected to cite some people who really are foundational in this work? I try my best to avoid saying things that some reviewers can't help saying, which is asking people for data that they don't talk about. And that's not my job. My job is not to tell you what I would have done. My job is to tell you how to make your work better. So I'm always looking for areas where I think you can do more to help explain things to the reader. And then I take my notes and I write up my review comments, and I try to make sure that everything I'm saying is justifiable, which is not always easy. Sometimes I have a hunch about something, but I don't feel confident in what I'm saying. And I try to only say things that I'm confident in about what will benefit this article and issues that I think the authors could benefit from thinking about a little bit more.
So my general approach is, how can I make this paper better? So I think about the different sections. Is the research question clear? Is it important to the field? If someone answers it one way or the other, does it have a consequence? Then next is basically a theory section. What have other people done in this area? And have they put all the past research into a coherent theoretical framework? So this is where people have a theoretical model. And I think often the biggest mistake that people make is that they just have, well, here's a variable that's an explanatory variable. Here's an outcome, and they seem to relate to each other. Whereas, especially for JLS, they want a strong theoretical framework of what are theoretical mechanisms by which one phenomena leads to another phenomena. And so I think that's the biggest question people who are writing for JLS want to answer. What is the theoretical mechanism? How do things work? And then in method section, it's about how do you design a study. Is this good design? Does it take into account different factors that people have found to be relevant in the past? Is the data collection done properly? Is it rigorous? They try to be representational or at least capture some aspect of an important population. And then the analysis part is, once you have the data, let's say it's well collected, how do you make sense of the data? That could be in terms of statistics, in terms of appropriate statistical method. It could be qualitative, which many papers are, in terms of do they have a clear approach to the problem, and if they document very clearly how they've done it. And the overall goal for methodology is whether or not someone can take the same question, run a similar study, and follow the same rigorous procedures. So are your procedures clear enough for someone else to do a similar study? And then there's also the results section where they report the analysis that they've done. Is it clear? Does it make sense? Are there any errors in the way they're presenting information? And then going to discussion, how does it tie back to what we already know? How does it add to it, or how does it change the way we think about things? And also the implications. So the implications could be for researchers, how people should do research in the future. What areas should they think about? It could be methodological in terms of, are there new methods that they've introduced? There are also practical considerations. So does it have implications for, say, a student? Should they behave differently? Or a teacher, or a parent, or a principal, administrator, or policy? So those are major things I look at.
So what I do is I typically read the whole manuscript first before I do any writing. And often I will read it as if it's already published. So I'll imagine that I'm reading it for a class or reading it for, my own work, and I'll try to interpret it as if it is already sort of a knowledge work that lives in the world. If I am able to do that, then that's my general indication that I think this is a piece that could be published. And then I start to go back and say, well, what could make that argument clearer? What seems to be missing? What is maybe overstated? And I go back through and identify key points in the manuscript where it could be strengthened. If I read it through and I'm not able to discern a clear argument, and I'm not able to say, oh, I get what this is about, then I read through again and go kind of section by section to try to figure out where I'm confused and use those points of confusion to try to help the author think about how to clarify.
So for me, it takes a while to read it and to read it deeply, and then I need a little bit of time to let the ideas sift and sort of think of what are the biggest issues. So what are the biggest contributions this article can make? Sometimes I try to read between the lines for maybe things the authors probably could have communicated but didn't communicate as well as they could have or should have, because a lot of times as authors we sort of we get caught up in some of the details and we forget about some of the bigger issues. And so I'm aware of that in my own writing, and I try to look for that in others. That's one of the biggest things I think a reviewer can do, is sort of see what's at the heart of this and what might help bring these strengths out. I try to give the authors some big overarching things and then to make a few suggestions. The suggestions I usually say they don't have to take. They're just my way to help communicate some of the things that might improve the article. And then they have a chance to write back, right? And sort of say, oh, I see what you mean, but actually I should be saying this other thing.
And usually I take a couple hours reading the article the first time and marking it up and then quickly just transcribing my notes. And then I take some time off, and usually the next morning, or at the latest the next afternoon, I sit down with it again, and then I go back and start reorganizing what I've got written down, and I start thinking about what do I think is most important. What are the key issues that I think the author really could address to make this better? And sometimes there may be issues where I felt like, wow, here's a problem. How might best they deal with it, or is this something that the author can really address? So, and then from there I just sort of organize my thoughts in that order. I say, here's what I think is most important, and here's what's second most important. And then usually at the bottom I include a bulleted list of minor points that don't really fall in any particular order, along the lines of, some typos or some suggestions about word choice or figures and tables.
When you're writing a review, I feel like there's a certain process that one always goes through. And the most important first step is to summarize the arguments that are made by the author. And I think a mistake we can make in reviewing is to react to the piece without first creating an actual representation of what the piece was trying to argue. We don't want to review against a straw man argument, so to speak. It's so that summarizing what the author is saying, and then when taking issue in a review and pointing out the things that you think need work, I think it's very important to speak in your review as though you were speaking to that author. Because again, with the author, you're trying to have a conversation with that person. And so even if you think that it is very inadequate, it's important to be a teacher in that moment and explain what you think was inadequate. And always trying to make the decision, do I recommend a revision of this article? Do I recommend accepting the article? Do I recommend rejecting the article? But regardless of those decisions, to try to strike a tone that's collegial, not just to be nice, but to engage in an authentic conversation about that work.
It's very important to really, when you're reviewing, put yourself in the author's shoes. Try to understand what the author is trying to do, and then how can that be, is that achieved well, or how can it be achieved better? I think also in actually writing the review, I think it's important to speak about the manuscript and not the author. And so, unfortunately, sometimes we see disparaging comments about the author. Oh, it's obvious the author hasn't read such and such, or this looks like it was written by a graduate student, which is one of the most offensive comments that I think can be there. And I think it's very important to speak only in terms of the manuscript, because we don't know what the author has or hasn't read. There might be a very purposeful decision not to include a certain piece of work, and then that's something you can debate with the author through the review, but it really needs to be in terms of what the manuscript is or is not accomplishing.
I think it's important to be strategic as a reviewer and not say too little and not say too much. Decide what the key issues are that you're going to try to give input on, and then craft those in a way that the author, the other reviewers, and the editor will all be able to interpret, summarize.
I check my review to see the overall coherence and that, and also the tone. So both content and tone, in that whether I'm making constructive suggestion, in really trying to help the editor to make an informed decision, as well as to help the author to find way to make the research better. Generally keeping in mind the suitability of this paper for publication, as well as how I can make it better. Generally, I work to really understand what the authors are saying and how is it connected to the broader field of learning sciences.